Hello and welcome to the next session. Our speaker is Laurie Nowatzke. And Laurie has joined Iowa State University in 2015 as a measurements coordinator for the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. Her work focuses on measuring the progress of water quality improvement efforts in Iowa and tracking the adoption of agricultural conservation practices in the state.
So for those of you who came to my talk at 1, I apologize, you have to sit and listen to me again. Originally, J.R. Buckle was supposed to give that previous talk, and he had another commitment come up unexpectedly, so you get to hear me twice, for those of you who came to both. I serve as the measurement coordinator for the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, so my main responsibilities lie in tracking progress of the strategy year to year, compiling and coordinating the annual report for the nutrient reduction strategy, so that we can kind of provide information to the public about how we think we're doing and working towards the goals of the strategy. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about progress in three selected Iowa watershed projects. So these are, looking more at small geographic areas of the state where we can kind of track nutrient reduction strategy implementation over time. So as a quick background, although I think many of you are familiar with this, the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy came online in 2013, and it was developed as sort of a voluntary measure for reducing nitrogen and phosphorus loss in Iowa in response to the EPA asking states in the Mississippi River Basin to start working on nitrogen and phosphorus loss. So nitrogen and phosphorus leaves Iowa through surface water, enters the Mississippi River, and then ends up in the Gulf of Mexico, and contributes to driving a hypoxic zone, deoxygenated area, which impacts biodiversity and fisheries. So the nutrient reduction strategy aims to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus loss in Iowa annually by 45%. Agriculture takes on a heavier part of that load than there is a role to play for many sectors in the state, but agriculture is the primary contributor of nitrogen and phosphorus loss. So agricultural or non-point sources have a goal of 41% reduction in nitrogen annually and 25% reduction of phosphorus. The remaining portion of that, to meet 45%, is worked on by point source facilities or like wastewater treatment facilities and industry. So to measure progress of the nutrient reduction strategy, we use this logic model approach. So for those of you who haven't seen some of us give this spiel many times before, what we're looking at is we want to see ultimately a change in water. So that's kind of the right side. That's our ultimate goal in the end. We want to see reduced loads of nitrogen and phosphorus leaving the state. In order to get there, we need to see incremental change along the way in other areas. So we want to see change on the landscape. So increased use of conservation practices in agriculture, improved technology in point source facilities. In order to see that happen, we need to see change in humans. So we're looking at, we kind of measure farmers' awareness of the strategy and their willingness to take on conservation. We look at outreach and education about these issues with farmers and with other communities as well. Also, point source community willingness to take on new technology and participate in those efforts. And finally, for any of that change to occur, we need to see change in inputs. So we're looking at total annual funding for nutrient reduction strategy related efforts, the amount of kind of staff and resources that are available, what kind of partnerships have formed. So for the annual report each year, we look at these indicators, but we tend to take a really statewide snapshot view. A lot of our data, when it comes to funding, conservation practices, certain indicators like that the sort of simplest approach to measuring those indicators is using pretty rough scale data. So for example, we rely really heavily on cost share program data to track conservation practice use. There are projects in development to move beyond just using cost share databases, but currently up until now, we've relied on cost share data. So this gives us, for example, a sense of how many acres of cover crops were funded by cost share programs throughout the state. And with this, we have some Huck-8 scale data, and then we can get a number. So we know that in 2016, around 300,000 acres were planted with cost share programs, and using surveys, we've estimated just over 600,000 were planted in the fall of 2016. So this is helpful for getting a kind of general overview, but a lot of the efforts happening around the nutrient reduction strategy are occurring in sort of pockets and areas. And when we take a statewide average rate or just a statewide total number, a lot of the really ramped up focused efforts in certain communities gets kind of washed out and kind of melts into the average. And so we wanted to see in specific watersheds, small watersheds, in areas where there's a lot of concerted funding and effort being dedicated and a lot of outreach. Are we seeing higher rates of adoption of conservation practices or other progress happening at a faster rate than on that sort of statewide scale? So I reached out to Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. They operate the Water Quality Initiative in Iowa. So this is a program that funds projects throughout the state, many of which are watershed demonstration projects. So these are specific Huck 12 or a couple Huck 12 watersheds that receive funding through this program to target cost share dollars and education and outreach and staff resources towards working with that sort of small, geographically combined area. So for example, do we have a pointer? No, that's a mic, sorry. So some of these sort of shaded green areas might be a demonstration project, a small area where farmers have access to this different set of cost share funds. So with IDOLS, we selected 3 projects to start to take a look at, and we want to expand this further, but we selected 3 projects that were in place at the start of the Water Quality Initiative. So they were funded beginning in 2014. They have water monitoring occurring in their project areas. They have watershed plans that are either being developed or are in place. And they have watershed coordinators, which help to kind of target resources and coordinate efforts in those areas. So we decided to look at the Boone River Watershed WQI, or Water Quality Initiative project. And so that's 2 sets of a couple Huck 12s up in the north central part of the state in the Boone Huck-8. I should say also all these WQI projects occur within priority watersheds for the nutrient reduction strategy. So these priority Huck-8 watersheds have been identified as areas of greater need for nutrient reduction efforts. We're also looking at the Miller Creek Watershed WQI, so that's 2 Huck 12 watersheds within the Middle Cedar. And we're looking at the Washington County or West Fork Crooked Creek Watershed WQI. And that's down in Washington County and Keokuk in the Skunk Huck-8 watershed. So we wanted to take this logic model approach looking at indicators year to year for that inputs, human, land, water approach and apply it to these kind of concentrated areas where these watershed projects occur. So taking it again from sort of a statewide level bird's eye view approach to a small watershed focus. So just some background on each of these projects before I get into some of the data that we've started to collect and analyze a little bit. So the Boone River WQI project began in 2014 and was renewed in 2017 for more funding. That's the case for all 3 of these projects that we're looking at. It's a large project area compared to the others that you'll see. It's about 141,000 row crop acres according to the cropland data layer through USDA. When it started up, it had an existing farmer champion network and farmer advisory groups. It's had pretty consistent watershed coordinators. Jordan Cleric is the current, is Jordan here? Okay, no. Jordan Cleric is the current watershed coordinator there. It's had strong NGO and private involvement. So the Nature Conservancy does a lot of work in the Boone River watershed, and the Iowa Soybean Association has helped with a lot of research projects and developing the watershed plan there. And yeah, as I said, soybean developed their watershed plan. The Miller Creek WQI project, and I think Shane is here, right? So that also began in 2014, renewed in 2017. It's smaller than the last project we saw, so 35,000 row crop acres according to the cropland data layer. It has not just a farmer advisory council, but it has a multi-stakeholder advisory council. It's had a very consistent and active watershed coordinator, strong NGO and private involvement like the previous project, and also a watershed plan prepared by Iowa Soybean. The West Fork Crooked Creek is the third project we're looking at. Again, began in 2014, renewed in 2017. Also smaller on the scale of the Miller Creek watershed, smaller in comparison to the Boone River project, 57,000 row crop acres. And they had very strong existing farmer champions, sort of a network of farmers that met as the project was starting, or even prior. And it was supported early on by INRS and Iowa State Extension. And it's had private involvement as well from Iowa Soybean Association doing some research trials, corn stalk nitrate tests, for example. And their watershed plan, last I checked, was still under development, but correct me if I'm wrong, for those who know. One thing to note about West Fork Crooked Creek is that it hasn't had, it's had a lot of successes, but it hasn't had a consistent watershed coordinator. It's had a lot of turnover within that position in recent years. So getting into sort of the inputs, so I'm just going to touch on a couple indicators we're starting to look at. This is really early in this project of measuring progress in these projects. So looking at cost share funding for conservation practices from both state sources and federal, so NRCS programs, as well as, so those two, so NRCS and state programs. So we see a general increase in funding for all these projects over time. The huge jump in Boone River at the top was due to a prep wetland going in. The red bars are funding for cover crop acres through cost share programs. I should note this does not include farmer contribution or landowner contribution to those contracts. So it's just the funding provided by federal and state sources.
Yeah, we're reading the x-axis.
Oh, so the x-axis, so that's thousands of dollars.
Oh.
So the scale goes from 0 to almost 1 million. So we're seeing variation across these three projects. We have Boone River on top, Miller Creek in the middle, West Fork Crooked Creek at the bottom. So pretty wide variation in the amount of funding that's been put towards conservation practices, and but in different geographic areas and with different programs in place, that's kind of to be expected. So again, red is cover crops, and then we have that's definitely the dominant practice, and then we have some additional practices as well. So this is by source. So year to year, the cost share funding for these projects. So again, Boone River on top, Miller Creek in the middle, West Fork Crooked Creek at the bottom. So again, variation in sort of the diversity of funding sources. So NRCS cost share programs tend to be more prevalent in some projects. So for example, RCPP kicked in, that's Regional Conservation Partnership program, thanks, Sean. So that's a federal source that kicked in the Boone River watershed over the last few years. Other projects tend to rely more heavily on state dollars through WQI or other programs. So that FSA, brown bar, that's the FSA, Farm Service Agency contribution to that prep wetland, which is a costly practice that was placed in the Boone watershed. So we're seeing, again, some variation between these.
Quick question right there. What percentage would the farmer contribute?
A good ballpark would be 50%, but it would depend on the program. So some of them might be 30%. So I haven't estimated yet what farmer contribution to these practices would be, but you can essentially assume for things like cover crops, farmers are contributing about as much as the cost share program is, but that varies a little bit. So I'm going to focus more on cover crops for the rest of the presentation because for a couple of reasons. One is that cover crops are really heavily promoted by the Water Quality Initiative and other programs pretty consistently. Also, it's arguably a practice that can be used pretty much anywhere in the state, given different management, I guess, techniques or, so there's variation in how cover crops are conducted in different areas of the state, but cover crops really can be used. If we looked at terraces, for example, that wouldn't be as prevalent in like the Boone River watershed on that top bar, so just because they have flatter landscape. So cover crops seem to be a good general practice to look at for the start of this measurement project. So for moving into the human component, so outreach and education in these areas. So for those of you who are my previous talk, you might have seen that we collect outreach and education event information from partner organizations throughout the state. Events that promote nutrient reduction strategy information, conservation, water quality efforts. And so we get this data each year. We've gotten it for 2 years and we'll continue to collect it. Participation from partners has been huge for this. About 15 to 20 groups, that's private, public, universities, and NGOs have contributed to this data collection effort so that we can kind of understand what kind of outreach and education is happening around the state. So for each of these watershed projects we're looking at, I just took the education events that happen in any intersecting county for that watershed project. County tends to be the easiest way to collect this information from partners, so, or they provide the town and we fill in the county. So what this does is it allows us, farmers don't stay in their watershed, so by using the intersecting counties around these watershed projects, we can get a sense of sort of what's happening in the area around those projects. So in 2016, Boone River Watershed had 24 events conducted by all partners, all sectors. And then 20 in 2017, but in 2017 you'll see that we're reaching another county, so it's a little more distribution around that area. Miller Creek went from 18 events in the 3 counties that it intersects to 34. And then West Fork Crooked Creek went from 4 events down there in Washington County to 13 the next year. So statewide, we've seen about a doubling of the number of events that have been held by partner organizations. And so we are seeing that within these project areas, there tends to be more distribution or increased outreach efforts in those states. So what we wanted to do is look at cover crop adoption rate. So statewide for 2016, it was about 2 to 3% of row crop acres as a statewide average was how much was planted to cover crops. So our main question, research question, is it higher in these very focused watershed project areas than in other, surrounding parts of the state? So the dark blue bar here represents the Boone River WQI project, so that small area. The light blue bar is the Huckate, so the Boone Huckate that surrounds that project. So extra funding and efforts and staff are occurring in those pink areas, and then there's additional programs in, that can apply to the areas outside those projects, but maybe not as much. So what we found is that cover crop adoption rate is consistently higher in the watershed project area than in its surrounding Huckate watershed. This pattern continues for, and this is as percent of row crop acres, if I didn't make that clear. And just for interest's sake, the Boone River project is averaging around $34 an acre for the cover crops that they're providing, or that they're funding. Miller Creek WQI, by 2016, reached almost 8% adoption rate through cost share programs. The surrounding Middle Cedar Huckate, using cost share data, showed much lower adoption rate at 1.5% by 2016. That project's averaging similar, so it might have been more expensive per acre for these cost share programs in the beginning, but currently it's at about $33 an acre that are being provided to the landowner for these cover crops. I should say that 2017 there was a huge jump in this watershed. Shane, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's up another 10% or so, right, of cover crop adoption in that area. We just haven't, for this project, we haven't analyzed 2017 yet. So we're seeing a lot of success as far as cover crops in that area. For the West Fork Crooked Creek project, a similar pattern, so the darker bar being within the WQI, up to 15% adoption rate among row crop acres. In the Skunk Huckate, where the project lies, we're seeing about 5%. This isn't a really dense cover crop use area. This project kind of attributes success to the fact that no-till was kind of culturally normal leading up to the project in that area, and farmers have been very receptive to taking on cover crops sort of as a next step. One farmer described no-till as the gateway drug for cover crops. So they've been providing lower cost share too, so this has been a very successful project. Farmers have been very receptive to taking on cover crops and at lower contribution from cost share programs per acre. So at about $23 an acre. So just as a quick summary, so farmer and community leadership and active watershed coordinators seems to consistently, at least anecdotally, be really important for watershed project success. Some projects face pretty substantial challenges in certain areas of the state just due to resistance by the communities, and that's something that having kind of farmer leadership really helps with. Multi-stakeholder involvement is kind of the norm with these projects, so involving private and NGO involvement as well as public and university involvement. Cover crop adoption rate is substantially higher within these WQI project areas than in their surrounding Huckate watersheds. And I didn't go into this, but existing water monitoring will aid progress measurement in the future. So these projects do have monitoring going on, and that's something we want to look at in the future as we move forward. With high cover crop adoption rate, for example, are we going to see empirically measured water improvements in that watershed? For next steps, we want to expand our funding analysis to include, there's a lot of private investment, for example, happening in, with that RCP group program in the Boone River watershed project. We want to include farmer and landowner contribution. We want to estimate the annual nutrient loads from measured concentrations, like I said, from water monitoring that exists in those areas. I want to start looking at other practices as well beyond cover crops. We can at this point model nutrient reductions that have been affected by practices that have been put in place. And so that's definitely a next step, is looking at, okay, we have this many cover crop acres, what impact has that had, both modeled and from a water monitoring perspective. Also, we want to expand this to looking at other projects. And one thing to note is that these 3 projects had a lot of activity going on before WQI came online. So from a scaling up perspective and bringing in more watershed efforts, can we get these kind of results from a brand new watershed project in an area that maybe hasn't had that much focus before? So we want to start to identify common characteristics among successful projects, lessons learned when it comes to those that have faced certain challenges, and start to incorporate this into kind of to complement our statewide look at nutrient reduction strategy progress. So with that, I'll leave my contact information up, and if there's any questions, yeah.
We're going to look at the effect on the benefit of crops when they're allowed to be grazed.
So cover crops that are that can be
cattle graze on.
Yeah, with the current data sources we have, we don't have the ability to look at whether cover crops have been grazed. There could certainly be survey work done to see if maybe in certain areas farmers are more receptive to trying cover crops if they also have livestock operations. But we don't have, with the data sources we have the ability to look at that right now. But that's a great point.
Maybe if we look at all at, total acres of those we feed users of the cost share programs, or more new users every year, it's the same people every year that are taking advantage of those, or is there any way to look at that?
There is a way to look at that certainly for the state data. We can look at who was involved in certain contracts, and some of these WQI funded cover crops are for multiple years. So if a farmer is continuing cover crops, they might, correct me if I'm wrong for those who are coordinators, they might be more likely to get cost share if they're continuing for their second or third year, if that's correct, or?
Well, up to those acres are producing, they're expanding in their operation and a lot more at
Yeah. I would actually add one thing that we'll start including in this work too is coordinators have been helping provide IDOLs with information about sort of how many acres farmers are trying outside of the cost share funding, and so we do have a little more data on that. We just haven't delved into it yet. So kind of understanding beyond these cost share programs, what are farmers and landowners doing. So, yeah.
That idea you're talking about, I'm not presuming you're the project that you're MCS, so if you get it at a point for scale and not 8, and if you get it for crop 12, you start comparing who the adoption cover crops, not the project areas, also what the facility to the project areas, or if it's kind of
That's a great question. We do receive HUC 12 scale data from NRCS for certain programs. So for EQIP and CSP, for example, and that's just started in the last year. So before that, it was all HUC 8 scale. So, but that's a good point. Like, starts to do some spatial analysis around the project areas. Is that starting to kind of spread out from those HUC 12s? Yeah. So.
Who collects the data, monitoring data, and how is that shared with the farmer / stakeholders? What are their perceptions of that data?
Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it depends on the project area, who conducts the monitoring, and where that data goes. I don't know, Shane, for example, do you all have monitoring?
Yeah, we work with the Soybean Association. I go out and collect samples weekly.
Yeah.
Producers receive reports from the Soybean Association.
Yeah. And they do make some of that data publicly available, but it would definitely be anonymized if it's farm scale. And then for like in-stream water monitoring, that would typically be publicly available through the SWCD or an NGO, whoever's conducting it in that project area. So, yeah. So another question?
Is
I noted one of your next steps was identifying common characteristics. And for the first two, you mentioned the watershed plan. Was there one involved in West Fork and Crooked Creek as well?
I'm pretty sure there's one under development in West Fork, Crooked Creek, but I'm not sure at this point if it's been completed or not. But that's something I need to follow up on. So.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's one thing that our organization has been observing as a critical success factor.
Yeah.
Where there's a watershed plan, good technical assistance, extra financial assistance, and then leadership and engagement. You know, farmers, agribusinesses, community leaders. We're really seeing the needle move as far as a much greater adoption of practices.
Yeah, absolutely. Having kind of diverse partnerships and that plan in place seems to be really helpful.
Yeah, if I can follow on with that, it seems like there is a lot of variation with watershed projects where sometimes, though, there is a lot of focus around flooding and water quality in the stream, and then there is a setup to monitor that change. And in some cases, it seems like the stream is kind of an afterthought. It's just sort of the hot 12s are maybe kind of more of a container for concentrating the assistance and cost shares.
Yeah. Was there a question? It's a great comment. No, I just trying to think. Yeah, that's true. And I think kind of understanding the stream processes within these type of policies is definitely one that's helped to understand the impacts of these practices. So, yeah. Thank you.